Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thank you so much for joining me this week for Doctrine and Covenants, sections 41 to 44. There's a lot of stuff in these sections, brothers and sisters. I hope you took some time or will take some time to review and, ponder on these sections. There's a lot of stuff in here, and we're just going to hit a few highlights as usual. Some things that stand out to me this time around, the studying of the Doctrine and Covenants, which I hope you are enjoying. This is an amazing book of Scripture. And I hope that you are really hearing the voice of the Lord as we discussed for the Easter week that is so prevalent and so present in this book in a remarkable way, where Jesus Christ testifies of himself over and over and over again as he reveals the things necessary to restore his kingdom on earth in the latter days, in this dispensation of the fullness of times, and as he testifies of his coming in glory. And there are some beautiful words in these sections where he talks about that time to come and the millennium. Not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I hope you're hearing it. I hope, especially in this last of the last days, that we are sensitive to these warnings and sensitive to these promises that are so prevalent in the Doctrine and Covenants as Christ announces his coming again, and the things that must be accomplished before he does come again. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on current events this time. At least I keep saying that, and sometimes it goes longer. I don't think it's going to be as long as last time. But again, so many things going on. And I just want you to know, I do try to check more than one source on these stories because, as I repeat many times, we have more information than honestly could ever have been dreamed of in previous ages at our fingertips. And we can look things up so quickly and communicate things so quickly, and things go viral all the time. But that doesn't make them true. And it's disappointing, to say the least, how much information there is online and, in our media that is not accurate. Of course, it's really hard to find anything without some kind of agenda. And I have an agenda on this podcast. I would like to put my widow's mite toward building the kingdom. I would like to testify of the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I would like to help to strengthen all of us in our determination to choose celestial glory and to build Zion. So, I have an agenda myself, but we have to be careful about what we consume. It's easy to get, a little too wound up about some things and then find out later that, okay, well, there was another side to this that maybe wasn't first reported in the place that I saw it or whatever. Anyway, so all of this, brothers and sisters, I hope you'll recognize is my best effort to report things that are true in our current events. I do, as I said, try to check more than one source so that I can make sure I'm not just being spun by one person's viewpoint. And in fact, I usually check several sources, which is, again, not difficult, but you just, hope that these things are accurate. And it's not my intention to misrepresent information. Okay, big disclaimer aside, this is a terrible story that happened within the past few weeks, and I imagine many of you have heard about it. Again, we had a school shooting in Florida, university in Florida, tragic loss of 2 people, I believe, and others that were injured. There is chaos around. There was an earthquake in Southern California. There are, Christians being killed in Africa, apparently especially during Holy Week. The whole Passover time is leading up to Easter, and then There was a report showing that many had been killed right around this time. I don't know that it ever eases up completely because Christians have been persecuted in that area for a very long time, but it does seem like the world is in commotion and evil is at home and abroad. But this was a track meet in Texas at a high school. There were tents set up for teams or whatever anyway. Some twin brothers were there at the track meet. Austin Metcalf and his identical twin. I don't remember what the twin's name is. But a young man that was also there, I guess, representing a school from another team, got in their tent, and there was some kind of scuffle that ensued as they asked him to leave because he shouldn't have been in their team's tent. And I don't know how aggressive it got prior to this, but it didn't seem to have lasted very long before the young man, Carmelo Anthony, who had a knife with him, and of course that violated all the school policies, and he brought out this knife and stabbed the young Austin Metcalf in the heart, and he died in his identical twin's arms very rapidly, apparently. So it was a very severe and lethal wound. I mean, this is tragic in and of itself in any case, and I know that there are many situations. I'm not reporting a lot of people get killed in this country and around the world. Anyway, death of this kind is always a tragedy. But what I wanted to comment on actually was something that came from my son Harper when we were speaking recently. So, as is the case often, fundraisers start on behalf of victims and sometimes victimizers or alleged victimizers or perpetrators. I was glad that people raised a lot of money for Daniel Penny, that former military guy who was in the subway in New York and trying to help protect some of his fellow passengers on the subway when somebody got violent and seemed to be in a schizophrenic event or whatever. Anyway, it was a seemingly pretty dangerous situation. People were certainly unnerved, and he jumped in and helped and then got accused of murder. So he was charged and tried for murder, and I think a lot of people raised money there. And I'm grateful for things like that. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't contribute to people that we feel like, deserve some help or whatever. But sometimes that kind of is a strange commentary on where we are as a society as well, right? Because in this case, as far as I understand, and I did try to check into this a little bit, but I can't say exactly, all the details are known. To me, I think some money was raised for the Metcalf family that lost their son. And, people are generous, so these things quickly rise in total amounts. And some people in the comments even were questioning, like, well, how much do you need for a funeral and things like that. And somebody said, well, maybe they're going to put together a scholarship fund in the name of their lost son. And I think those things are great if something like that happens or the money is used for some good cause like that that's not just profiting off a tragic event, of course. Anyway, but what Harper mentioned was that the alleged killer, and he apparently confessed to police who were quickly on the scene and caught him. So it seems pretty clear that he was the one who wielded the knife that killed Austin Metcalf. Anyway, Carmelo Anthony has immediately sparked, again, I'm not saying he started it, but people started fundraising for his defense and his family. And that fund seems to have outpaced the contributions for the victim's family quite a bit and is apparently somewhere around $500,000 as of the time of this recording. So it's a lot of money that is being raised. Now, sadly, this quickly becomes a racial issue. And I don't want to get into the weeds on that right now, and I'm certainly not trying to offend anybody, but we do have some pretty clear statistics that young Black men are vastly overrepresented when it comes to the commission of homicides. They are also vastly overrepresented when it comes to being victims of homicide. There's a lot of Black on Black killing that happens in some of our bigger cities, and it's horrible. It's horrible that there's on both ends of that, of course. But I don't know if you ever listened to Jason Whitlock, who used to be a sports commentator and then has become more into social and political commentary. He is a Black man, and he had some really interesting remarks about the trouble with violent crime amongst Black men. I'm not going to, again, get too much into that, but I do want to say a couple of things. Okay, I never even mentioned the Harper comment. Harper's comment, and apparently he posted something online about this because even though he doesn't post very often, he was struck by the fact that all this happened in the Easter season. And he said, if it's true that the money being raised for the murderer is significantly outpacing the money given to the victim and his family, then, he said, the crowd has chosen Barabbas again. Now, think about that. Easter season, we know what happened in that first Holy Week. We know that when the crowd was given a choice, because it was the Passover and it was the custom of the Romans to release a prisoner as a sign of respect for that high holy day, that Pilate offered the crowd Christ or Barabbas. And Barabbas was a known thief and criminal. They knew that he was a repeat offender, so to speak, and he was presented as, do you want this criminal back in your community, or this man in whom even Pilate had found no guilt, and it certainly was a completely innocent, pure lamb. And the crowd chose Barabbas. So thus Harper's commentary that if, in fact, people are giving more money to this young man who confessed to murdering another young man over a scuffle in a tent at a track meet, then they're giving to the victim's family, then the crowd has chosen Barabbas again here at the Easter season. Anyway, it's really tragic. I think I'm going to do some content on Patreon. And again, thank you so much for you Patreon subscribers who are making it possible for me to continue this podcast. I am so grateful to you, but I appreciate your patience. Every once in a while I go through periods of time where I'm catching up with other things and I don't have enough energy to do a lot on Patreon still, but I have some things in the works, so we'll be posting soon. At any rate, I do think I'm going to do some extra content on protest masculinity. I've talked about it before, but it's worth another mention in a place where you can access it easily if you would have interest in that, which really does explain a lot of the violence that's happening in some arenas of our society. Really fascinating kind of sociological understanding of what happens and human behavioral studies understanding. It's not talked about often enough. I read about it many years ago, and it really, really made some great explanations as to why we're seeing so much violence kind of fomented in media and music and amongst some groups in our society. And particularly with fatherless youth. Now, Carmelo Anthony apparently comes from an intact marriage. Both of his parents were on some kind of event or in an event where they were raising support for that young man. Okay. We're going to go on because there's so much to say about particularly Section 42, but let's hold off on this other current event stuff until the next part 2. I'm going to mark this for next time, and let's talk a little bit about these sections in the historical setting. The Lord commanded the saints living in New York to move to Ohio. We talked about that last time, promised that they would receive his law there, and that was in section 37 and 38. So in February of 1831, shortly after the Smiths arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, 12 elders of the church met and prayed together as the Lord had commanded them to do, and that's in section 41. So this is in section 41, which is a relatively brief section in today's studies, that tells them to have the prayer of faith and they will receive God's law. That's in verse 3, a rather short section. Now also, we're going to mention that this section 42 that is called the law of the church, and it says that in the heading there, is sort of a compilation of a few different revelations that were received. So it didn't all come at the same time. And let me point out that throughout the Doctrine and Covenants, God will reveal additional information to increase the understanding of how to live his economic law. So this isn't the entire comprehensive explanation of the law of consecration, but it certainly sets some good foundational principles, and it gets them organized at a time when things were challenging. Because again, Joseph and Emma had just arrived in Kirtland as directed, coming about 300 miles from Fayette, New York. And he had given through revelation instruction to the other saints to gather to the Ohio. So a lot of people are making this move, but things are a little bit chaotic in Ohio as the saints gather. They are rapidly doing missionary work, so a lot of people are being converted, and this, of course, ends up provoking, not really, but the response is persecution from people around. They don't like the fact that this is a new religion. It's quite different. It claims authority. It's got a golden Bible involved, a living prophet, all these things that really challenge the beliefs of the apostasy. So there are a lot of troubles with their neighbors and things that hinder the work. And then we've got the troubles from within the church that we've talked about as well, and we see it again here. So there were some issues, let's see, I wanted to get to a little bit. There were a lot of poor people coming, or other people who had given up a lot to come to the Ohio. Remember last time in the readings, it said, if you can't sell, just leave it, which you're kind of like, okay, don't let the potential buyers know that, but the Lord had instructed them, if you can't sell your property, I want you to go anyway. So right off the bat, we're seeing these real sacrifices expected of the saints. I don't know why we forget that sacrifice is such a huge part of joining the kingdom of God. But what does sacrifice mean? It means giving up something of value for something of greater value. And in the process, letting it be consecrated into something holy. So the Lord isn't going to remove that from his people because there's such a huge benefit that comes from sacrifice. It's hard up front, and then it opens the windows of heaven in so many ways. So we're seeing real sacrifice from these people as they move to Ohio. Then Edward Partridge, around this same time that they're coming to the Ohio, is called to be the first bishop of the restored church. And that is mentioned also in section 41. So all this is happening around February of 1831. We haven't even accomplished the first full year of the church's formal organization. But it's coming up close to a year from the time the Book of Mormon is published. So all of this is happening in a pretty rapid way. Now, when the prophet arrives at Kirtland, he discovers that in the absence of his presence as a prophet guiding their people, the saints had, attempted some things that were really not in accordance with God's policies, which, again, needed to be revealed. But there were lots of questions and misconceptions about spiritual manifestations. There's a woman, I forgot to write down her name, who is claiming to get revelations again, as had happened before with Hiram Page. And then how do they live together as a community of saints when they're gathering? They're starting this first effort at gathering from wherever they are first converted to the church into more of a central church group. Some of them thought that, okay, this is a time to live as the early Christian church lived, because we know that in the New Testament there's a record that shortly after the resurrection of Christ, when the saints are trying to get organized into the early Christian church at that time under the direction of Christ's apostles, they attempt a communal life. Not a communal exactly, but the law of consecration, right? So to have things in common and so on. But what does that mean? There are many different groups, not just in the church, who have attempted some kind of communal life. And honestly, there are some pretty horrible stories that come out of those attempts. So, these people weren't doing such a hot job either, although they may have meant well in the beginnings. Now, on Isaac Morley's farm, some of them had gathered to live there because there was some space, and they called themselves the family. A group of them started to call themselves the family. So they tried some sort of having all things in common approach, but they didn't know how to do this. So one example of how this went wrong, I'm sure there were others, was that a man named Heman Bassett took a pocket watch that belonged to Levi Hancock. Both of these guys were parts of the family that was trying to live, by the early New Testament church pattern. And he took the pocket watch and sold it. And then he was asked, why did you do that? And he said, it was all in the family. So apparently Levi responded he didn't like that kind of family doing and would not endure it any longer. So immediately we've got issues arising, right? So Joseph Smith learns of these problematic attempts and knows that many saints are sacrificing and leaving a lot behind to come and join the gathering of the saints. He knew that these people were going to need money, and the church itself would need money and goods and property to help the poor and assist the immigrants that are coming, with or without very many belongings of their own. So they meet together, 12 elders with Joseph Smith, and they pray for the Lord to manifest his law and get section 42. And they did ask 5 specific questions. I'm not going to get into all of them. Apparently, the first 3 are what are dealt with mostly in section 42 that came in a series of revelations that were then combined into this section. So, and the rest of the answers were not published here, but they all had to do with how do we organize and how do we maintain order with this people. So let's look at some of the highlights again of these sections. I do want to say something about Edward Partridge before we go into God's law economically. Such an amazing man, and he died fairly young and is buried in Nauvoo. We could say a lot more about each one of these amazing characters in the early church, but I'm just going to read a couple of things here. As you may remember, he was called to be the first bishop of the church and suffered many persecutions when the saints moved to Missouri, which was another gathering spot. So again, more sacrifice, more relocation. You can see why these people really were refined sufficiently that by the time they built Nauvoo, they didn't even need a jail. They probably weeded out a lot of people who were not that committed to the cause because the sacrifices just continued. First, leave everything and come to the Ohio, and then go to Missouri, and then leave Missouri, which was revealed to be the location of the New Jerusalem, but time was not yet. So leave that expectation and hope behind and come to Nauvoo, build there, and then get chased out of Nauvoo and go to a great Salt Lake desert that nobody wants. So a lot of refinement during this time. And again, whatever we're going through here in these last days, I hope that we see that the Lord always chastens his people and desires to give us opportunities to be refined, to become more steady and steadfast and diligent and boringly consistent in our obedience. Edward Partridge was one of those who was tarred and feathered by mobs because he would not renounce his faith in the Book of Mormon. He died as a faithful member of the church in 1840 in Nauvoo at the age of 46. An obituary recorded the following about Edward Partridge's death. He lost his life in consequence of the Missouri persecutions. So, while I don't have the details here, it's very likely, and this did happen, some people lost their health or sustained injuries that never completely healed along the way. So they're making the tie-in that it was because of the persecution in Missouri that Edward Partridge experienced that he eventually died at such a young age. And he is one of that number whose blood will be required at their hands. Then his daughter commented on her father's willingness to sacrifice. And in her words, she says, to leave his merchandise and spend all his time in the labors of the church. And that actually is a direct quote from section 41. Sorry. But then his daughter adds that her father sold his property and realized but little from the transactions. She added, my father's course in joining the Mormon religion and sacrificing his property caused his friends of the world to think him insane. That's quite a statement, but she must have been an eyewitness that her father was ridiculed for making such sacrifices for the kingdom of God. She continues, they could not see what there was in religion to make a man give up all worldly considerations for it. So it does seem like Edward Partridge, of whom it has been said, was like Nathaniel of old, because there was in him no guile. That's also from section 41, that he was completely willing to sacrifice everything for this new religion that had been restored by the heavens. In section 42, now we have a lot of information, and I'm not going to try to encapsulate very much of it because there's just so much great counsel given to us. Much of it appears in other scriptures as well, but I hope that you'll enjoy reading through that and hearing the admonitions again. Some of the 10 Commandments are repeated. It's really the last 5 that talk about how we should interact with others. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because here they are gathering to Ohio and they're having to be in close juxtaposition with other saints. And we're talking about people from different places, different backgrounds, coming from different religious traditions. Whatever their joint belief in Joseph Smith's restoration of the gospel, or God's restoration of the gospel through Joseph Smith, and their belief in the Book of Mormon, that doesn't take care of all the differences automatically. That has to be a process. And I think about that a lot, as you know, when I think about preparing for Zion. Like, how are we going to really heed the words of our prophets from forever, telling us that we need to give up our pride, give up our enmity, not worship any of the idols of the world or other gods, but to bring our hearts, our tender hearts, our soft hearts to the kingdom of God, and to both honor with complete fidelity our love of God, meaning we obey his commandments with increasing diligence and consistency, and also love our neighbors, no matter what they're up to. And that doesn't mean we don't have to sometimes protect ourselves or have appropriate boundaries to navigate life's challenges, but we don't harden our hearts. We don't hate. We don't contend. And there is a really beautiful but demanding path in all of that to be able to continue to progress toward Zion. And, I've thought a lot about that in our highly politicized world. And it's not that I don't have my own political leanings and beliefs. I just really don't want to ever become super negative towards those who disagree. I don't want to hate anybody. I don't want to be angry at anybody. I want to look with compassion on people who are stuck in places that maybe I disagree with, maybe I strongly disagree with, but that I refuse to hate. I want to still love my enemy. I want to bless them that persecute, pray for them that despitefully use us, that there's no other path that is acceptable to God. And that takes a while. And sometimes it's easier to do that from a distance, and it's hard to do it in our families. It's hard to do it maybe in our neighborhoods or in our ward. But boy, brothers and sisters, if we're going to be Zion, we got to figure that out. And we can pray for God's help in doing that, because yes, maybe it's beyond our human capacity to really perfect that, but it's never too hard for the Lord if we're willing to invite him into the process. We're making pretty good time, but I have a lot to share in the second part. So let me just mention a few more things about section 42. It talks about how to deal with offenses. And again, there's a lot here that we're going to talk about in part 2, actually, when it comes to God's economic principles. But kind of skipping over that for now, we're going to talk about this statement at very close to the end of section 42 that just caught my attention. It's talking about how to deal with sinners and how to deal with iniquity. And it even says that, do some of this stuff according to the law of the land, people who steal or murder and things like that. But then in verse 90, if thy brother or sister offend many, he or she shall be chastened before many. Now that's interesting, don't you think? Like, he does talk about, like, if someone just offends privately, handle it privately. Or just you go to your neighbor if he offends thee and, try to work it out. If that doesn't work, then there may be an appeal to the elders of the church. But here, if they offend many, this person should be chastened before many. Now, this is not about public shaming in a negative sense, but it is about shame. And that is what really caught my attention in the next verse. And if any offend openly, he or she shall be rebuked openly, that he or she may be ashamed. So, okay, why did that catch my attention? Because I'm a counselor, and you don't have to be a counselor to know that shame has become really demonized in our culture and in our society. But it's a therapeutic society, and we go overboard in all these areas in some really, really serious and destructive ways, and this is one of them. To eliminate shame has been incredibly destructive. There are some things that we should be ashamed about. Now, the kind of shame that should be avoided, of course, is the kind that is really destructive of a person's self-worth. And there are people who have been treated so badly or punished so severely in their youth, perhaps, or somewhere along the way, or by an abusive spouse, whatever, that they do feel inappropriate shame just for being themselves. And they have been told that they should be ashamed of themselves in that way. And it's personal, it's their worth, it's their identity that is being discarded and damaged and demeaned. So that is never okay, of course. But we, as, again, a therapeutic society, have gone all the way to the other side of the spectrum. And now we say, oh, I don't want to shame my children. And you know what? That never sat well with me, even when I was a mother at home. And it was already starting to be part of a cultural language a little bit in our society. And I used to talk to my kids about it and say, like, no, there are some things that we should all be ashamed of. It's good to be ashamed when we do shameful behaviors. Again, not to dismiss our worth as a child of God, not to challenge that in some fundamental way, but to feel appropriate remorse. So anyway, there are some things that shame can really help with if it is done correctly. So anyway, worth a discussion with your kids and or grandchildren when you get a chance, or if you get a chance. Because healthy shame can help us recognize mistakes. Now, I've talked to parents over the years many times who've said that they have a child that just doesn't feel ashamed about anything or regretful or doesn't even feel healthy guilt for like hurting a sibling or hurting somebody else or being really disrespectful to parents. And I always was pretty firm about that. Well, you want to work on that. Like, don't just settle for that because some kids do come more difficult in that way. They just have a very strong personality in that particular area where they tend to bluster and tend to have normal empathetic responses, whatever that means, but softer empathetic responses just roll off their backs. They just don't even go there and they don't feel bad when they hurt somebody. And now, I'm not talking about psychopaths or sociopaths, which are generally created by the way they are raised and things that happen in their youth. I am talking, though, about sort of a minor version of that, which has become sadly very prevalent, where we have too many people who don't feel guilty even when they really are hurtful to others. And when you have young children who seem to respond in that way, please do something about it. And what I'm saying is like, don't beat them up. This is never about being demeaning or physically brutal ourselves. Never okay with God. What I am saying is that we need to teach and incentivize. And that may take some consequences for sure. In fact, I know it will, but don't be afraid to address that. And if you have a kid that says, well, I don't care, then that needs to provoke another response or a series of responses that talks about like, okay, well, that's a problem that you don't care because we don't live alone on this planet. We don't live on an island without anybody else there. We have to get along with other people. And God has told us we have a responsibility to care for each other and to treat each other appropriately. So that needs to not just land with this like, sort of non sequitur approach where someone can say, I don't care, or a child can say that, and then we just leave it as if like, well, I don't know what to do about it. We can do something about it. Again, it's going to take a little more effort. Some of our kids are more naturally able to feel guilt or remorse. Some are not. That doesn't mean we don't do something different. We need to make sure that we address that issue. Don't give up. Pray about it. There will be ways to do that. Again, I've got those 3 parenting videos. I don't know if I speak specifically about shame. Probably don't, but I do talk about ways to incentivize the behavior we want and how important it is to not just try to address the behavioral component, but also to internalize the values behind the behavior that we want to encourage so that our kids ultimately can govern themselves. But they can't govern themselves to begin with, so don't jump the gun. Okay, so it helps people to recognize mistakes, to feel appropriate shame. It helps people to take responsibility. It helps with empathy for others, which really needs to be one of our goals as parents, to help our children develop empathy. Again, some come sort of naturally empathetic, some do not. It helps them to, if they feel ashamed, to be motivated to make amends. And that would fit into the requirement of making restitution where that's possible and to promote individual growth. If we feel shame about certain things and we don't want to feel that way again, that's motivational to help us grow and become. It also should include, of course, self-compassion, meaning that, again, this is not about trying to define ourselves as worthless in any way or beyond redemption, but just to realize that, like, okay, if we make mistakes, we're human beings, and this is why we have a savior. So it's not about giving up everything. And you see that some kids go, again, they swing really wide. And so, at first they don't feel any shame. Then all of a sudden it's like, I'm a terrible person and I'll never be any good or whatever. And honestly, it depends on the kid, but that sometimes is just a defense mechanism. Well, then I'll just say I'm horrible so that my mom and dad will stop talking to me about how I should feel shamed or feel guilty. So anyway, don't fall for that. If that's what's going on, explore it. But like neither of those responses is okay and should just be left. We don't want to just leave our kids to themselves in those spots on either end of that spectrum. And then re-engagement, which is such an important point because if people feel appropriate shame about their behavior and take ownership and do the restitution and don't swing too wide from no empathy to then all of a sudden I'm a horrible person, but they find, with our help, find their way into a healthier part of that spectrum, they can repair the relationships that they've injured. And all of us can then follow this too, of course, when we need to be ashamed about something. And that can happen in marriage. We can do things to our spouse that we should be ashamed of. And I hope that we are. And I hope that we go and follow this process of taking responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can repair, because if we don't do these things, what happens so often is that we retain enmity and we see the person as a reproach, because every time we interact with them, there's a part of us, whether it's acknowledged or not, or whether we're conscious of it or not, that hates the feeling that we did something bad to that person and haven't repaired it. And so often it creates long-term alienation in that relationship, or we start to be really resentful of the people that spark that kind of awareness in us that we did something wrong, and we end up making it worse. And we see that. It can turn into hatred against those that we've offended. Really toxic stuff. Okay, I'm going to mention briefly that in section 43, as I said, there was that woman who was getting revelations. I should have written her name down, but she was getting some people to listen to her. So section 43 kind of reaffirms that Joseph is the mouthpiece of the Lord. And then sections 45, no, I'm sorry. That's a verse that I'm looking at later in the podcast in part 2. But I just wanted to mention quickly that section 43 has some really beautiful things about the coming of the Lord in his glory. He mentions briefly the millennium, and to meditate basically on or think about the solemnities of eternity. Nice phrase there. Just a lot of beautiful promises that I hope you enjoy. He does say, I'm going to mention this, verse 11 of section 43, "Purge ye out the iniquity which is among you, and sanctify yourselves." And the reason I mention that is because, like I said, in section 42, there's a lot about how to deal with people who are sinning. And the goal here, especially at this early time in the dispensation, was so sacrificial. This effort was so refining, but it had to include not tolerating a lot of deviance, because deviance creates problems from inside. They already have tons of persecution from outside, and it's going to get worse. And God is like, we really have to deal with these problems as they come up, because lots of people are joining the church, but maybe not all of them are very committed to living even the basic 10 commandments. So when there are problems, they need to be purged out. And that doesn't mean we immediately cast people out, but if they don't repent, that was an admonition that they need to leave the group, because we can't just pretend that's okay and let them continue to cause trouble when there is so much sacrifice involved, so much effort at creating something that can become a worldwide church that we enjoy today. Now, clearly in our day, this is still the law of Zion, that bishops are judges in Israel and have the admonition to keep the church regulated in terms of unrepented sin. It doesn't always happen the way we would like it to. And we have talked about the wheat growing with the tares. So let's not worry about that too much, even though there's still the functioning of the bishops and our membership councils, which, like I said, if they want to take a suggestion, I would say let's call those reconciliation councils. But the idea there is to purge the church of iniquity, however well it functions in our day. And of course, it is a worldwide church, and it's going to have to be cleaned up when Christ comes. So I'm okay with that, because I know Christ will take care of it. All right, we're going to end part 1 here. But I do want to say, brothers and sisters, that we have the privilege of receiving God's economic order, which we're going to talk about quite a bit now in the second part. And it is amazing how much smarter God is than any other source of economic theory. And I hope we can become increasingly grateful for these gems that are given to us as God's people, that allow us to create Zion living. Let's work at being Zion ready, brothers and sisters. It's coming. It's coming. Let's choose glory. As ever, thanks to my beloved husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.